What's up, everybody? So today I wanted to talk about sports psychology. Surprise, surprise. One of my favorite topics, of course. So one of the things I think that has come to me recently of like, oh, I should make a video on this again is reprogramming our reward systems. And the reason is because as players, our incentives that we have that are in the video game that just exist by default do not serve our goals of growth as players. If you are a game developer and you're designing a video game, you're looking to get the players hooked on the game loop. You want to hit all those like dopamine buttons as they're going through the game loop. You want the gameplay to be fun, enticing, engaging, satisfying, so that people enjoy just spending their time on it and spend as much time on it as possible and tell their friends about it as well to also spend time on it. So that's what they're trying to do. And in any kind of single player casual type of game, it's not really something that we should ever care to think about. And in fact, we are there to enjoy it. That's the purpose. But there is a conflict. If you're playing a multiplayer game and you are competitive minded and you want to improve, and that's your main prerogative, it's your main goal is to become a really good player, suddenly these incentives no longer really align with what you are trying to do. And so the first thing that we need to understand is one, like what are these incentives that exist even doing to us in the first place? And then secondly, how do we change them? And what are some of the rules around doing that will actually be helpful? And what are some of the ways that that will benefit us ultimately in our goals? So firstly, what's actually going on? So as I've said on a lot of the different videos, the psychological element the psychological elements that are most important are generally emotional. Like, we're emotional creatures, and it's the emotions that tend to hijack us and can either tank our performance or vitalize it and energize us and make it even better and get us into the zone. And so we all are experiencing some amount of emotion at any given moment, even if that's somewhat of a lack of emotion. So it's really important to understand in the game when these different rewards are happening, how is it affecting us? So when we look at the different rewards, it could be hitting a headshot, it could be winning the match, it could be getting some like more MMR, for example. Now the inverse is true because all those things I just mentioned feel really good, but the inverse is like if you lose the game, if you lose the MMR, if you're underperforming around your peers, if you are having a bad time with your mechanics, missing shots, these will be things that feel bad. And so that's not good, because good practice necessitates that we have control of our emotional environment. Because if you're looking to get into flow state on a routine basis, if you're, the flow state is an interesting one because a lot of people talk about this. I only understand flow state within the context of esports very specifically, but I would say that with flow state, there is an emotional component that's very, very important. However, that's not the only thing that's important and contributes to flow state. Like, you can't just, for example, master, your emotions in some optimized way for flow state and experience it. It also intersects with your practice pretty heavily. And that's something I can talk about in a different video. Either way, our emotional state is very important, and we want to place ourselves in a spot where we will play our best. Because what we understand about the emotions is that if you're experiencing the positive emotions, it enhances your performance. If you're experiencing the negative emotions, it does the opposite. It makes your performance worse. And I can just give you some examples. If you are, feeling bad because you're losing or missing shots, your confidence starts to diminish, which then starts to diminish the way that you interpret scenarios. You feel less capable. So the percentages in your brain change in a way that is not actually true per se. It's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because you feel less confident, you are less likely to hit the shot. Because you're feeling like, I've only been experiencing failure, you're more likely to be fearful and anxious in terms of taking decisions, because you don't want to fail again. So now it's kind of like this almost like beaten dog syndrome thing, where you're kind of afraid to approach these scenarios that you should be approaching, that are very normal to approach, because simply you're expecting a bad outcome, or you're afraid or anxious about the bad outcome. And we've all experienced this when we're playing. Just let's say, even if there's not a heavy emotional component involved, if it's the case that you've tried something over and over again, it doesn't work. If you tried that thing again, well, you're going to feel like I shouldn't do it. I shouldn't do that thing. And that may not actually necessarily be the case. And the reason is because we need to try to remove this emotional component. We don't want to be in this negative emotional state. We want to avoid it, because equally, there's a lot of other things that can come from this that that are to our disadvantage. We might start blaming our teammates. We may be less energized. We're less dialed in. We're less focused. We are less interested because we're not having a good time, which means that our ability to be creative goes down. If we're happy, that's when our creative energy is the easiest in a video game. When we are able to be curious, we're able to be better open to information that is, let's say, coming at us constantly, because we're able to pick up more information, because cognitively we're able to absorb more as well, because we're in a more cognitively absorptive state. We're able to absorb more cognitively at that moment. Anyway, so our performance cognitively is enhanced by positive emotions. Like, we understand all these things. So anyway, so what we want to do is we want to understand that these are all things that are happening. We want to firstly say, well, number one, we don't want to be outcome oriented, because this is like one of the first things that helps us to deal with this, is to understand that it's not just that we shouldn't be outcome oriented, but the reason why is because we can't control a lot of these variables. They don't really speak to anything about us per se. Obviously, there's some element that speaks to you, but we don't want to overplay that very much. We just want to understand that the outcome is the outcome. There's lots of variance. It could be that outcome for varying reasons, but what is within our control? And so the two things that I think are always going to be in our control, largely speaking, is our psychological reaction, so our mental state, our mental reaction, as well as our decision making. Now, you may make bad decisions, that's totally fine, but you're still in control of all of the decisions to a large extent. So we need to understand what drives our decision making, and we need to understand if our decision making is good or on par as to what we want. So if we are instead not aligned with, let's say, hitting headshots and winning games, and instead we're like, okay, I want to improve as a player. I have a goal to become a really great player, and I know that becoming a great player necessitates winning and losing. A lot of losing, actually. It probably mostly necessitates losing. In fact, failure is actually more important, because you're going to fail more always at the beginning and the middle and probably the end. There's going to be constant failure. So you have to get used to it, and you have to start to leverage it to your advantage. And so if I go into a situation, a gunfight, and I say, okay, my incentive is that I want to know if I make a good decision, I'll feel good. Like if I go through my process, I feel good. If I feel like I'm growing, I feel good. All those things should be exciting and fun. Just like hitting the headshot or winning the MMR, like all those things is exciting and fun, because you know it ties into your greater goals. So I go into the scenario, I lose the fight, and then I ask myself, okay, I lost the fight. I don't care about whether I hit the shot or not. I'm doing my training, and my mechanics are being taken care of. I can hit shots, I can miss shots. I shouldn't focus on that. But what I want to focus on is, did I make a good decision? Was I an advantage in this fight? Okay, I was an advantage in this fight, but was I in enough advantage to take this type of fight in this context? Yeah, I think I was. Is there something else that I would have done differently? Is there something I could have done differently? Okay, I don't think that there was. Okay, cool. Boom, I feel good because I just went through my process, and I can now reinforce what I just understood to be a correct choice that I would make again with my knowledge. Now, if it's the case that you're saying, oh shit, this is a mistake, I shouldn't have done this, and then you start to understand like why you shouldn't have done it, that's also a win. You should also feel good because you just grew in that moment. You just got some information that helped you to achieve your goal, which is to grow as a player. Because we can't, I mean, how ridiculous would it be to say that you should be better without having what you need to be better? That's kind of what we're saying if we expect to be good all the time. We have to fail. We can't be good all the time. The game is so complex. Any esport game is so complex, and there's so many complex systems that are constantly interacting. It's just unreasonable to think that you shouldn't fail or that shouldn't be normal in some respect. So if we go through this process over and over and over again, what you'll tend to find is there's an interesting side effect that's quite positive, actually. It feels like it could be negative, but it's actually quite positive, because what you'll find is that it starts to be the case that you'll be a bit more desensitized to those kind of emotional reactions that you get from hitting the headshot, that you get from losing the match, like whatever it might be, because you are going through this system that you created for yourself over and over and over again. And then as you're doing this, um, you're going to be, I think, better equipped to be a stable player, to maintain confidence, because you're not getting your confidence knocked by the emotions as much, either to the up or to the down. And equally, this is super helpful with discipline, because discipline is about creating a disconnect between that emotional state and the emotional reward state and what you know you have to do objectively, because that's usually the issue. I've mentioned this, I think, in a previous video about the idea that they have in Buddhism, which is the difference between that resistance is an emotion, and that they have this idea of right action, the sense that every human being has an emotional response, but the emotional response is likely not going to be a rational one, and that there is a level of resistance to doing the thing that is objectively the right thing to do, because maybe it's the case that you're anxious. Like, I don't want to go do this thing. It makes me feel anxious. But in reality, that's the kind of right action in that context. And so by encouraging yourself to do this process over and over and over again, you create this world that's very helpful for you to kind of take the knocks, but also to deal with the moments when things feel really exciting, because those moments can also kind of send you like over the edge. Like if you think of like the performance bell curve, it can send you too far over the edge and your performance plummets. And so this happens quite frequently when you're thinking about performance as a range, because you have performance as this like range, and this is like your comfort zone. If you go like outside the range to the good or to the negative, you'll notice it. But what we want to do is we want to try to expand our range to the good and we want to get comfortable in that new range. But that can be kind of hard sometimes because of how exciting it is when we're performing well, when we're hitting crazy shots, and that can just kind of knock us out of it sometimes. So it's helpful for that. It's helpful for being disciplined, for not being greedy, and for not succumbing to some of those emotional states that produce those mental game leaks. So that's another extra added benefit. There's also an element of pride, I think, that comes from this, because you're doing so much work that's so focused on growing as a player. There's not going to be very many players around you that will have a similar focus. Equally, there is also this sense, I think, that's connected to this, for me at least, of always trying to understand, okay, well, where is the growth? And, as Bruce Lee said, Bruce Lee said, flow like water, my friend. Like this idea that you can be in any kind of scenario, because we've just isolated this idea that we're in an environment that has a lot of variance, but one of our jobs, one of the concepts we want to apply is trying to separate out the variance from the things that we can actually control. So if you're always in that mind, accept the variance, be like water, just allow it to kind of, whatever's happen. And then you can be flexible and you can find the value in whatever environment you're in. And so I think to kind of cap off this video, I want to also impress upon you guys that it's always good to have at least two active focuses in these two different core areas as we are playing the match. And I'll explain why it isn't three. So the two would be the mental and like having a mental focus. So the mental focus can really be so many different things. It can just be like having a good degree of mental prep, pre-game prep, where you've decided how you will mentally handle certain scenarios. I have decided that I am going to, enter this game giving it my all. And any moment I notice that I'm not in that frame, I'm going to like remind myself and I'm going to kick it back into full gear. Or anytime I'm in a scenario which feels like very difficult, I'm going to find solutions. There's lots of ways you can kind of prime yourself before you play. This is like a mental pregame that I talk about a lot. So it can either be maybe mental pregame, or it could be in the moment you've decided that you have a standard that the way that you react to things is a certain way. And it's hard for me to kind of just like you throw examples out there because everyone is very different. But for me, it could be a common one that I think is experienced by many people is how I react to, others, teammates, and just, being able to sort of practice acceptance. So it could be a focus on mental acceptance. And one thing that's like nice about this is the acceptance can kind of grease the gears a little bit, because sometimes you can get really stuck and bogged down by these difficult scenarios that just make everything harder. But if you can just accept it and be problem solving all the time, that's a great focus to have mentally when you're playing. Now, going into another one, we've got the decision making, the theory element. So you can always control your decision making, and so having focuses that revolve around decision making every game is really also quite important. So whether that's the example I used, which is to say, okay, every fight, am I in advantage or not? So like when you die, you can kind of assess that scenario, and maybe you clip it if you feel like you need to look at it later for whatever reason. but that could be one, or it could be other focuses that you've decided to apply. This is a pretty broad area, but essentially the idea is that there should be some decision making focus, a way that you're learning or growing, to understand how to become better at making decisions in the game. That is also another very broad one. So going through specific examples, it could be thousands of things. When it comes to the mechanics, now this is something that you shouldn't have as an active focus when you are in your performance, because, and it shouldn't be a part of any sort of incentive or reward system. Why? It's because it is fundamentally fundamentally it has variance, and so that's the reason why. And so, and also equally, the more that we focus on actually trying to aim, the worse it can often become. So that's kind of a problem too, because aim should be secondary. It's a secondary process. You train your technique, you grind the technique, you get warm, and then you have whatever aim you have on the day. You know, you're not going to be able to change too much about it on the day. So because of that, we just have to have our our focuses for how we improve our aim and our technique training, whatever, however that looks, because that can look a different way for many people. And that's taken care of. Cool. Elige used to say that he would find himself to be, the deepest in his A game as possible when he is super focused on like calling for his team and calling, like communicating information. Because basically that means that he's super dialed into the game and he's using so much of his mental bandwidth on extracting information from the game, from everything that's happening, like situational awareness, looking at the mini map, communicating what it means to his teammates. He's so in the map, in the game at that point, that all of his cognitive like abilities are kind of going towards that, which then means that his aim is actually in the best place to perform, because it's going to be completely secondary. As soon as you start focusing on your aim, you'll notice that in the game you'll be a lot worse, because a lot of aim is a technique work is performed in that way, like in your brain, but also as soon as you start diverting cognitive bandwidth to your mouse actively, you're going to be losing that cognitive bandwidth, that active focus on everything else that's happening in the game. And so you're going to have worse positioning, you're going to have worse awareness, you're going to have worse communication, you're going to have way less tools. So you're using your cognitive bandwidth poorly in that regard. So yeah, a few extra added thoughts on top there. But yeah, I think going back to the original point, be very intentional about how your reward systems or your incentive structures work, because as the famous quote goes, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome.